What's up, everybody? This is Karak with ACG, and welcome to A Funfactor Explained. Today, we're going to look at We Happy Few by Compulsion Games. There will not be any spoilers here, and this is footage from the review, so some of it may not match up with exactly what I'm going to say. I'll try to cut it to make sure that it does so that you guys can understand it, but unfortunately, due to spoilers, you got to really watch out with that. Something I talk about a lot in the reviews is Funfactor, and Funfactor is so different for so many different titles. That's one of the reasons why you've seen these videos pop up for particular games. One of the things with Compulsion's game here is the unfortunate inclusion of a large number of bugs and issues. And though we did end up getting a patch here recently, unfortunately that didn't fix any of the issues that many of us had. But there is one thing here, a uniqueness to the story that I wanted to discuss and that really did impact my own personal fun factor, despite me not giving the game a buy rating right now. So let's begin. I find it interesting that when you look at the way this game really works and really starts, you have these three wicked-in characters. They're interwoven. There's an interaction between these stories that we don't necessarily see all the time, and it's not just the fact that their narratives can overlap, and indeed you do have that, but it's the fact that some of the skills as you're playing can actually impact some of that story delivery, and I just want to sort of break it down. You know, when you look at a game like, let's say, XCOM, where you're Overlord, you're over the top of multiple characters, and we always joke about what it's like to be one of those small characters and we name them. You can really imagine, in a strange way, We Happy Few is the opposite of that. You are that character. There is something overarching going on, though, and that's what you end up gathering as you continue to play and gather the information from these three stories. So let's say you start out the first part of the game and you start out that first story. There's all of these other mechanics. This is really interesting when you break it down because the game was not headed this way originally. There was going to be some kind of story, but it was nowhere near as detailed as it is now because they did hinge on those survival mechanics. And a lot of people looked at that game world. They weren't necessarily happy during early access. So Compulsion Games said, okay, we're going to make sure that we have these different stories interlaced with one another within the game and have survival aspects tied to those particular stories. And I think that's the juice here. That's where things really change. How many times have we jumped into most survival games and you always have the exact same requirements? Here, you have some that overlap. Most do, let's be honest. But you have a couple that in particular do not overlap. And that's where the interesting parts of We Happy Few start to crop up. For example, one of the characters has a skill or a survival requirement that really does require them to return to the same place a number of times. Now, this is a little bit different than, let's say, the other two characters where they can end up meandering around and doing different things, sort of not necessarily setting up base wherever they want, but in a way, just sort of identifying a particular spot and being able to move from there and not feel like you're missing something. Not so with at least one of these stories. That continual survival element that's connected to that not only just is a stat that we always see, but there's a very clear narrative focus on that stat. And that's something we do not see in a lot of games. In a lot of games, it's just like, you're thirsty, man. And you're all, okay, great. I know what thirst is. If I don't drink, I'm going to be dehydrated and fucking constipated and finally die on a beach somewhere. But in this game, it's a little bit different than that. And there's the narrative slant, and there's a reason for this. In fact, you could almost say that some of these survival skills are connected to other characters. And really where that begins to pay off is as you continue to play, you find different skills that maybe you didn't get with one character that you can get with the other that allows you to unlock more of the story that you couldn't get as that first character. But interestingly so, some of the different elements of the story are slightly adjusted depending on which of those three characters you play and how you get that information. And in fact, the way you interact with the game's story and the different characters you've played already adjust your narrative because it ends up adjusting the filter in which you accept that narrative into your own storytelling base, into what you think of the story as a whole. I would say in many ways it's a little bit like Detroit Become Human, except there aren't any narrative choices that you can make. You can't decide to be mean to somebody or something like that unless it's actual action where you punch them or shove them, don't take your joy, and they attack you. What happens here is the active becomes passive and the passive becomes active. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of times you have the ability to instigate an issue and some can instigate it with you. But when you don't do those things, your passive skills sort of blossom out and new locations or at least new experiences are available to you if you don't do those things. There's a really cool tit for tat that goes on. You start to notice this pretty much right away when you jump into the second character and you start to go to places that the original character went to. And the different things that the characters say, this is that internal monologue that I think matters so much in a lot of games. And the story here is brilliantly done through that inner monologue. It's one of the situations where in a lot of games, they'll just let you experience it yourself. Maybe they won't have an inner monologue for the character. Here, they do need it. It is a slightly confusing, overarching world at first, and having that inner monologue allows for you to really understand various different idiosyncrasies that each character has, including some of the skills that you may want to upgrade. Now, without, once again, getting into spoilers, you start to notice this as you continue into that second playthrough. You might have noticed it in your first one, but you're already informed that there's 3 stories right when you start. And I think a lot of people will be focusing more on the survival elements. But if you pay attention and you look at the way things are going and you really sort of take in and solidify that story from that first character, and the second one comes in and really ends up making you question what the first character was thinking or doing, not necessarily against them, not thinking, oh, they were completely wrong, but thinking of a different element, of a different tact. And in fact, the way the characters interact, you start to go, I get it. Now I know why this character did this or this character did that, when originally maybe you thought, oh, they're just being a jackass. I love that interaction. This is something that I don't think anybody expected with this game. And it's like the Rudy of storytelling, where it just keeps popping its head up. No matter how many times you push it down, that story starts to pop up and starts to overlay over the top of this experience. And the fact that you have those skills, those survival skills that are tied to things that are in particular for those characters, really does elevate this to a level that I have to say, this story is incredibly engaging to me. And it's engaging also because 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 of us could all play this game and have different ideas of the story, not in the way that any other game's stories are delivered. Maybe a Detroit Become Human is a good example of something like this as well, where you all have these experiences with the story, but in those games you get to choose what you say. In this one, it's more choosing what you do. And I think that that's the big difference between, let's say, a Detroit and a this, where in this one, it's how you react, how those skills allow you to react. In fact, you might want to do something in this game, but really can't do it because you don't have the skill, or because you don't really feel that maybe you can live through a battle or an encounter to find that little bit of extra detail. Those intriguing elements, I think, are what elevate this game above the original expectations even I had. When I looked at those survival elements, I was like, you guys saw Walking the Walk. I did. Technically, there's some really interesting stuff. When you jump into the game world, you see this odd procedural generated town and cities and the different way everything is put together, and finding out that everybody's procedural generated town is going to be a little bit different than everybody else's, and that some quests may not even be in some other people's stories, I thought was really a fantastic way of doing it. And it leads to an air of mystery. And it is too bad that it does have a lot of technical issues, and some of those gameplay issues do end up becoming unbalanced, especially as you continue. But what astounds me is that this was put together in the time frame it was put together in. You've got your narrative layer, your vocal layer, you have the different things that you can find around the game world, you have the different experiences, you have that varying and just slight adjustment of attitude between the way people react to you as the 3 stories continue and the way you can react to them. That inner monologue that plays out, just fantastic stuff. This is what we want from games, to question, to look into the mystery of something. Another way in which they layer in the actual mystery is when you look at how every character you take out, knock out, or kill has a name, and you start to really wonder, what am I doing? And you look at your Bioshocks and you look at your overarching mystery there and the discussions later. I think regardless of any other situations going on with this title, that is something that you see from almost anybody playing it, is that they really did like the story. Whether they love the game or dislike the game, that story keeps popping up in a lot of people's experiences. And that's why there is a fantastic subtlety to something that was created so quickly like this. You have to really look at development and wonder if that's how it happened. If that's why it's so good, is because the way they put it together and the quickness in which they needed to sort of get all of this done. Maybe that crunch time for the story ended up elevating it because they knew they couldn't put in a ton of filler. And what's there, almost none of it is filler. Here's the cool thing. It can appear to be so. There are multiple different comments, especially in the first 2 stories, that I was like, this is odd. Okay, I sort of understand it. But I thought of it more as a Bioshock, where I thought, by the time I get to the ending, I'm going to understand the general overarching storyline that's going on, and then be able to discuss that in some mysterious ways with other people and sort of try to figure out where their mystery led. But as it continued, the mystery was actually inverted back into the story. Instead of me taking away and walking away and talking to others, I ended up sitting and really thinking about that experience and thinking about that story and trying to identify exactly what the hell was going on before I could even talk to other people. Again, I think it's because you have those three stories. They're overlapping, and their interaction with one another and with their skills is something that I want to see in future games a ton. I love the fact that there's narrative that explains some of these things, and whether they're annoying or not to you, whether they're bothersome, whether those skills are annoying or bothersome, you can turn that difficulty all the way down if you wanted, and you can play with those almost not making any real change in your gameplay itself, and you can experience those stories, and you can start to see how everything comes together. And I really do believe story here absolutely impacts the fun factor at a much higher level than I would have ever assumed a survival game would have had. When I go back and I look at those procedural levels, and when I was looking at them for the review, there were times where I was like, are these procedurally generated in a certain way to mimic the effect you might have if everybody was hopped up on fucking joy the entire time? And that's what I liked so much about it. I think as we've continued to play and seen other people play, that's probably not exactly likely. But just the sheer chance that you have to think about that really does elevate that narrative a bit. This is something, like I said, we want in games, something I'm incredibly happy to see in games. A lot of people love to pretend that if a game even has some bad parts, the game absolutely is terrible, every element of it is terrible. Or if there's one excellent part of the game and they absolutely love it, then the game is perfect. That's not the way real life works. When you look at a situation like this, you can glean the different elements and you can really identify the excellence in some of them and unfortunately the lack of efficiency in others. Anyway, that's it for me. Absolutely enjoyed the story. If you get a chance, maybe check it out in some way. I don't know if you decide not to get it, but there's various different ways you could check that out, even if it's just on YouTube and watching somebody let's play it all the way through. So that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Maybe check out Reddit or Twitter. And of course, if you want to become a patron, you can do so on the Patreon website, which allows me to do videos like this and reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap, because I buy every single game I review, even if a dev gives a free code. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your weekend.